I think it's time we welcomed today's guest speaker. We are lucky enough to have the author of this wonderful course, Gateway. So Dave Spencer will be talking to us today. So Dave, if you are there, if you could turn on your camera and your microphone.
Hello.
Hi Dave, welcome. Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. So everyone, it's my great pleasure on behalf of Macmillan Education to welcome Dave Spencer. Dave, after studying languages at Oxford University, went on to become a secondary school teacher and moved to Spain. And he has been working, living there in Madrid, and continues to teach teenagers every day. So a real expert in today's topic. And what is today's topic? Well, he's going to unravel the myth of why our teenage students don't speak to us in English. So thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Dave. So Dave, over to you.
Great, good. Checking again, just can you type in if you can hear me okay? Could you just guess if you can all hear me? That's looking good. Okay, great. Well, it's an amazingly sunny day here in Madrid, in Spain, where it's 5 o'clock. Amazing seeing so many people from all around the world. There are lots of names there that I recognize and places that I've been to, some places that I haven't been to yet. This session is about encouraging teenage students to speak in English, in their own language. And it's going to be a very practical session. There will be lots of interaction. So at many times in this talk, I'm going to ask you if you agree with me or not. I'm going to ask you some questions. So please type in your box and participate as much as possible. I will try and read your comments, okay? Now, the reason that we're talking about speaking today is because I think speaking is possibly the trickiest skill to practice with teenagers. This is a graph which is showing the level of students just in the Spanish region of Madrid, 15 to 16-year-olds, and it's showing the difference in level that they have in the different skills. And you can see that listening is the strongest skill. Then we go to writing, then we go to reading, and finally we go to speaking. And I think that's typical not just here in Madrid, but I think in general, teenage students maybe struggle most with speaking more than any other skill. In this session, I want to discuss at the beginning why I think this is, and then I'm going to give you some simple activities that you can try out today, tomorrow, next week in your classroom and see if they work for you. Okay, so the idea is, why is speaking difficult? Well, if you look at these different faces here, I think that those show you some of the reasons maybe why teenage students don't speak. There are a whole different variety. And obviously today I'm going to generalize a little bit about teenagers in general. And obviously each teenager has a different character and maybe a different personality. But I want to think about what are possible reasons why teenage students can be reluctant at times to speak in English. Now, the first session of this talk, I want to put some statements on the screen, and I'd like you to type in if you agree, disagree, or you think it depends, okay? So for example, my first statement, it can be embarrassing for teenage students to speak to their friends in English. Do we agree, disagree, or it depends? Okay, now so far that's interesting because most are saying most are saying agree, and maybe it depends. I think my first point is that I think that it can be embarrassing for many teenage students. They are a little bit self-conscious. They might be a little bit embarrassed about speaking in front of the class in their own language. but speaking in another language can sometimes be a little bit embarrassing. A personal anecdote, I loved languages when I was at school. I loved French and I loved Spanish, but I was not very happy about speaking in French or Spanish sometimes because I felt a little bit embarrassed. And maybe even today, I feel a little bit embarrassed about speaking in your languages when I visit, because I'm afraid I'm going to make a mistake in Russian or in Italian or whatever language. Okay. So, and you noticed possibly with my first slide, did you notice that in fact boys are in fact slightly weaker at the different skills, including in speaking? And I think there are statistics which show that boys in particular feel slightly more embarrassed about speaking in a foreign language. Now, of course, there are things that we can do to help this. I think Scarlett Rojas is saying it's different if you're doing pair work, and I agree totally. That's one of the reasons why we should do pair work, so that it's slightly less embarrassing than in front of the class. Throughout this talk, I'm going to give you a few tips, little tips that I have learned also about speaking in class. I think that sometimes there are people in each class who speak really, really, really well. Maybe they've been to the UK, to the US, maybe they've just got a special gift for languages. Sometimes those students can cause a few problems just because other students compare themselves with the great speakers. And I think that it's worth speaking to that student individually, maybe even speaking to the class, making them understand that they shouldn't always compare themselves with other people in the class, because it can be a little bit demotivating. Fear of comparison, exactly. Right, now a second statement, okay? You can motivate students by getting them to realize that one day they may well need to speak English to travel or for work. Agree, disagree, or it depends? Agree, agree. Right, lots of people agree. I think it depends. And I think it depends because I think for many teenagers, the idea of one day using English to travel or for work is too far in the future. It's almost like science fiction because the students don't really think that they will ever be speaking English to do these things. And I think that it could work, but what will be more important is short-term motivation to encourage the students on a Tuesday morning, on a Wednesday afternoon, to speak about that now, okay? In the future will come, but right now we need to encourage them at this moment to speak. So yes, as somebody's putting there, yeah, long-term, so it could work, but I think that there are other things that will work better, which is basically short-term motivation. And I will give examples in a minute. My third statement, in a full class, if 4 or 5 students are not doing a speaking activity in English, we should stop the activity. Number 3, agree, disagree, or it depends? Okay, this is nice because many of you have the same opinion as me. I always talk about this because I think that as teachers, we like perfection and we would like everybody in the class to be working in English all the time. And I think that the reality of our working life is that many students do speak, but some don't. You will never probably get 100% of the students speaking in English 100% of the time. And I think that we need to be realistic about this. And I think that we need to be ready for it to happen. If you stop an activity because some people are not doing it, you will never really be able to give the students a chance to try to speak in English. So we need to be realistic, I think, and accept that some people will not do the activity all the time. Now, my fourth statement, we need to have a special seating arrangement in the classroom to do speaking activities. So do you agree, do you disagree, or it depends? Right, we've got a bit of a mixture. Right, now let me explain about my working life. When I began to teach English, I worked in a private language school, And our classroom was like this. We call this in English the horseshoe shape. And this is very nice because the students can all speak to each other. They're all looking at each other. And so you can have communication between any student at any moment. But I cannot do this where I teach now. I teach in a normal class and I cannot do this. And I can't usually make my students move the chairs at the beginning of every lesson because it's too much time, too much noise. So my classroom is more like this. Is this like your classroom? Rows of students in lines? Right. I mean, this for me is my reality and has been my reality for 20 years. But it's not a problem for me, okay? Because obviously it's very easy to do pair work in this format. You simply get students working with the person next to them. One thing that I want to suggest is that it's a good idea to change partners too. So why not get the students to work with the person behind them? Yeah, as Daniela said, I think a U shape is ideal, but it's not really realistic in many situations. So we can get students working with the person next to them. We can get students working with the person behind them. Another simple thing that we can do is we divide our class into two halves and we give them numbers. For example, if we have a class of 20, you give one half of the class a number from 1 to 10, and you give the other half of the class a number from 1 to 10, or 1 to 15, whatever. Then you simply check that the students remember their number. So you ask them, can you put up your hand if you're number 3, if you're number 6, if you're number 5? And then, as Julie says, then you simply say, okay, find your partner and work with that person. Now, I don't do that every day, but from time to time I do this because I think it's really important that we keep things interesting and keep things fresh by changing partners. I find that if the students are working next to each other throughout the day, throughout the week, throughout the month, always with the same person, the interaction gets a little bit boring because they do know each other quite well. They might be friends, but in the end, they maybe know each other too well. So I think that it's a good idea just occasionally changing partners, and it brings a bit of sparkle to the activities, okay? And so there are lots of different ways of dividing students up, but my main point is that from time to time, let's change them around so that we have interesting dynamics in the class. Another thing that I wanted to mention is that when we do pair work activities in the classroom, I think it's always a good idea at the end of that activity, when the students have been talking together, that we get some feedback. The feedback stage is useful because we find out what the students are talking about. We show that what they are talking about is important. We check that they've done the activity. And I think it's really a significant moment. Shorter. This should be a short feedback session, not as long as the pair work. Just a moment to check that everybody is on the same page. And another tip is that once you've done that pair work activity, I often ask them to tell me something interesting about their partner. We talked about embarrassment, and I think that sometimes it's easier for a teenage student to talk about their partner. Yeah, somebody said, what have you learned about your partner? Exactly. That way you are getting information, you're checking that they did that, but also it's easier to talk about a different person than to talk about yourself. If I say talk about something interesting you did at the weekend, you might not think it's interesting. But if I say tell me something interesting about your partner's weekend, I think that's easier to do because of the embarrassment factor. So I must admit, my talk is full of things that I'm sure you know and that are basically common sense, but I think they're just little tricks and tips that work to help you to get the most out of your oral work in class. Now, my statements number 5, less correction and more praise can encourage teenagers to speak more. Agree, disagree, or it depends? Number 5. Somebody said definitely. Most of you are agreeing. And I think that this is actually a key thing. Obviously, you don't want to overpraise, and you don't want to praise when there is no reason to praise. But I certainly feel, particularly at lower levels, particularly at lower ages, I think we really need to encourage our students. We need to build their confidence. And the reason why I think this is this quotation from a great book called Games for Language Learning. The greatest mistake, if oral ability is the aim, is for the learner not to speak at all. And I think this for me is almost like a mantra. I want them to say something. If they make a mistake, it's not the end of the world. If they don't speak, then it is the end of the world, because we're not getting any practice at all. Okay? With time, when we teach them more, their level will get better. Now, if you've seen me giving talks about grammar, you'll know that I often talk about the pathological grammar obsessive, okay? And I think one of the problems that we have as teachers is that we are obsessed sometimes with grammar. And I have a little conversation that I think you'll find quite funny, but I think it's a possible conversation in our classroom, okay? I want you to imagine it is Monday morning and your student Ivan walks into class and you say, "How are you today, Ivan?" Okay, and Ivan says, "Very bad. Yesterday my father had an accident." Okay, and you, the teacher, you say, "No, Ivan, that's terrible. It should be my father had an accident." And then if you are a real grammar obsessive, you say past simple for a single completed action with a specific time reference. Okay? Now, as you've seen, this is a joke, but it is true that sometimes as teachers, we do become a little bit obsessed with grammar. And I think the important thing, particularly with teenagers, is to listen not to how they say something, but what they say. Okay? And as somebody said this morning when we gave this talk, a normal person would have the reaction, well, can you put in the chat box, if your student said to me, "Yesterday my father had an accident," what would you say to them? What would your message be? What happened? Is he okay? What happened? I'm sorry to hear that. Right now, you know, this is a joke, but I do think there is a part of our brains as English teachers which is to listen to the grammar. And of course, the problem is that if we don't listen to the message, then in the end, when Ivan comes into my class and I ask him, "Is he okay?" then he will not speak to me. So this is an exaggeration, but I think it's important to remember, if we want students to speak, we need to listen to them and react to them as human beings, not just as English teachers. Okay? So let's remember, yes, when we do a grammar exam, we correct the grammar. But when we're doing a speaking activity, the first thing that we want is for them to have a go. The question is Ivan communicative with what he says? Is it easy to understand what Ivan said? I mean, it's totally clear, isn't it? He says yesterday, so we know it's not today. We know it's not habitual action, so there's really no question. So, very important. Let's listen to what the students say, not just how they say it. Great. Now, my sixth statement, we should force students to speak in English at all times. So, would you agree, disagree, or it depends? Right, I can see you're a very good audience. You're generally saying things that I agree with. I think that the word force is the wrong word, maybe. Would you agree? Force is not the best word to use here. If I said we should encourage students, I think that sounds much better. I actually wonder if you can force a student to speak in any language. Forcing people to do something is not so easy. And I don't know if I can force my students to speak in English, but certainly I can try to encourage them. I can try to motivate them. I can try to get them to want to speak in English. And I think that is our challenge in our classes. Forcing is not really possible. Encouraging is what we want to aim for. Now, number 7, the problem with many speaking exercises is that students often don't know what to say, not even in their own language. Now, what about that? Would you agree, disagree, or it depends? Right, again, a lot of you are agreeing. Obviously, everything depends to some extent, but a lot of you are agreeing. And I also agree with this. I think the main problem with students in speaking is that they're not quite sure what their ideas are. Now, if you do know Gateway Second Edition, you'll know that the speaking pages are called Developing Speaking. And we call it developing speaking because we're helping them to speak. We're not just telling them to speak and to do something. We try to structure the activities to help them. Now, we do this by, first of all, setting the scene. So we get them to know what the topic is that we're talking about. In this case, it's eating out in different places. Then what we do is we get the students to listen to some students doing the task. And I think that this is a model. When we teach writing, we often give a model text. I think when we teach speaking, we should also give them a model conversation. So the students can then actually have an idea about what they have to do in the activity next. When the students have got the context, when the students have heard the model conversation, then what we can do is pick out expressions that will help them to be able to do the activity. They cannot do the activity if they haven't got the language, the vocabulary, the expressions, the phrases that they need to do the activity. So we need to scaffold, as you're saying, we need to scaffold the activity so that we're giving them all the help that they need. And then we give them strategies, okay? So in this case, we're just making sure the students realize that in a negotiating activity, they need to help each other to speak and that nobody should dominate the conversation. It should be 50-50. So a good dialogue, a good conversation is 50-50. We get them to think about this strategy, and then finally, we give them the task that they need to do, okay? And this is important, that we build up the language, we build up the situation, we give them a model, we pull out the vocabulary, and then finally, we give them the task that they need to do. And I think doing it this way is the best way for success because the students have no problem doing what they have to do, okay? But if we do it the other way around, this is what we call throwing people in at the deep end. We could simply begin with giving them the task, but we know that the students will probably not do it very well. And I think the problem with throwing people in at the deep end is that sometimes they sink. And I think that with our teenage students, we don't want this to happen, okay? Because once they have had this anxiety of doing the activity badly without enough help, I think it can be very demotivating for teenage students. Maybe throwing adults in at the deep end can work very well, but I think with teenagers, this strategy works less well. Okay, so I think I would go for scaffolding, not for this approach, which is really pretty traumatic. And my last statement, okay, number 8. It's a good idea to motivate students to speak by giving tasks that are game-like, are competitive, have a specific goal. What would you say? Agree, disagree? Okay, this is perfect. A lot of people are agreeing with me. For me, we talked about long-term motivation. Long-term motivation can work, but I think sometimes it's not very effective. I think then we have to make a student want to do an activity because they enjoy doing the activity. And I think a little bit of competition, we have to be careful with competition because they can get obsessed with the competition. But I think that a little bit game-like, competitive, and having a specific goal helps to give you a successful activity. Somebody has mentioned that the age makes a difference. I think that's possibly true. The higher the level, the higher the age, it's easier. But certainly as it's younger teenagers, if we want them to get involved, then I think that this can help. And really, what I want to do now is to look at specific activities that we can do with our students. And they're all activities that I think are pretty easy to set up. They don't need special material, and you can try them out this week in your classes. The first one is the easiest activity of all. I call it top secret. I'm sure you've done something similar. Okay. The activity is very easy. Write down 5 words beginning with the letter G, but don't let anybody see your words. Okay, so that's pretty simple. I think you would agree. And we could do this at any level. We could do this at beginner level. We could do this at advanced level. We could do this as native speakers. Okay. You tell them to write down the words, and then you tell them in pairs to define their words, and their partner has to guess the word. Now, this is extremely simple, okay? Very, very easy. In fact, I'm going to do it with you, okay? I'm going to define a word that begins with G, and I want you to tell me what the word is, okay? Are you ready? It's a type of biscuit, okay? And it's in the shape of a person. And I think that it's maybe quite typical at Christmas. Oh, that's very quick. Okay, who was first? I can't. Daniela maybe was first. I don't know. It's a gingerbread man is correct. Okay, so there's a competition. It's quite fun because it's enjoyable to know if you can identify the word. I'm going to define a second word. Are you ready? It's made of ice. And it's very, very big. And I think maybe many come from the North Pole, and they are melting quickly at the moment. So who's got that? Caroline, I think, is the first one. It's a glacier. Okay, right. It's very, very simple. It's very basic, but it's a really nice warmer at the beginning of the class. Now, the students might do this, try to do this in their own language. If they do, unfortunately, I think you have to use a bit of blackmail. And what I usually say to my students is that if they want to play the game, then we do it in English. And if they don't do it in English, we're going to stop because it's a waste of time doing it in their own language. So because they enjoy the activity, they try their hardest to do what they can. If, of course, we're worried about grammatical mistakes, well, the real thing here is communication. If the student has understood the definition and identifies the word, then I think that that's perfect. That's all you need because the communication has been successful. Okay. Somebody's asking about instruction in L1. We'll come to that. It's Ahmed, okay? We'll come back to that later. Can you remind me if I forget? Now, this is very similar. I'm sure you've done this before in your classes. Pair crosswords, okay? Have you ever done this? This is actually from Gateway, from the Resource Center, the Teacher Resource Center, and the back of the teacher's book in the first edition. And this is one of my favorite activities. It's got a very clear goal. It's got a nice competitive element, and it's fun, okay? What happens is student A has one half of the crossword, student B has the other half of the crossword, and of course they have to define the words that they have on their crossword. So for example, if I'm student B, then Switzerland, then I would say, okay, it's a country in Europe, it has mountains, they make chocolate there, they also have very good cheese, and it's quite an expensive country. Okay, so the idea is simply that the students define the words and they have to listen. And of course, this is very good for relative pronouns. So it's a language which, it's the body part which, it's the place where. If you look on the internet, I think quite easily you can find programs where you can make your own pair crossword. So simply type into Google, for example, and see if you can find a program so that you can make your own pair crossword with the words that you want to recycle. But otherwise, if you're using Gateway, then of course you can use the example which comes in the Resource Center. So I think that's a great little activity. It's one of my favorites. The students find that they work hard because they want to be successful defining the words. Now, a third activity is you're pulling my leg, okay? Now, I imagine we all know that this is not literal, that I don't actually want you to pull my leg, but it's an activity that I'm sure you've done maybe at the beginning of the year. You tell your students, write 5 things that you did in the holidays. But you could also write 5 things that you did at the weekend, or you could write 5 things that you did last week. But you tell your students to make the sentences, some of them true and some of them false. Okay. Obviously, the false sentences should be more or less credible. Okay, so you tell them that don't say that you went to the moon, because everybody knows that that is not true. Now, this is actually an example from me. Okay, so my last summer holidays, number 1, I had a brilliant time helping my daughter to assemble her first piece of IKEA furniture. Number 2, I went to Kiev to watch the final of the Champions League. I don't know. Number 5, I saw the Chinese terracotta warriors. Can you, let's see if you can spot my lies, okay? Can you just tell me if you think that, put the number and tell me true. So for example, you put 1 true or 2 false. Let's have a quick poll to see what you think. 1 true, 1 false. You think 5 is false. Somebody thinks 1 is false. Some people think 1 is true. Okay. Okay, would you like to see some photographic evidence of me showing if these sentences are true or false? I'm going to show you the evidence, okay? Now, of course, we can't do this as a speaking activity because you can't speak back to me. What would happen in the classroom is that the students would be able to ask and answer questions to find out more information to see if they believe the person or not, okay? So we've got lots of genuine communication. Here are my photographs. Okay, and you can see that in fact number 1 was true. Okay, so I did have a great time doing some IKEA furniture with my daughter. Okay, number 1 was true. What was number 3? Many people say number 3 is false. No, well, number 3 you can see. Can you see number 3 is true? That's my son graduating in the summer. Okay, a very proud father with his son. And in fact, the Chinese terracotta army, of course, I didn't go to China and I didn't see the whole of the Chinese terracotta army, but this was actually in the Museum of Liverpool. Okay, yeah, and somebody has seen Liverpool. Vanessa, yeah, that's right. That's the port of Liverpool. Okay, and that was the end of a round the world yacht. And Elena thinks that the final was not in Kiev, but it was in Kiev this year, the final of the Champions League. I know because my team lost and we did lose, but I didn't go to Kiev, okay? Right, very simple activity. Another thing to say is that photographs are always a great way to get people speaking. And in a minute, I will do another activity, which is using photographs, which I think work nicely to get the students talking. Now, I'd like to make a few points. I think somebody did mention this just before, okay? I think this is really important for me. One of the reasons why I have done this activity using examples of myself is because I think it creates a very positive atmosphere if we do share information about ourselves. I think that students like to know about us. Teachers often ask personal questions, but they sometimes forget to give personal information, okay? And I think it's important that we do share our own anecdotes, even with teenagers. Now, the question here, and this is my next point, if you ask students about something personal that you yourself would not like to talk about, think again. Now, I believe this quite strongly. If I am asking a personal question that I would be uncomfortable to talk about, I think that is a bad sign. I think that that means that you're asking them something which is unfair. And for me, a main criteria is that if I ask the question, I should be willing to answer the question myself. And I think it is an atmosphere of trust. And I think that to get a positive atmosphere where students are not afraid to speak, then I think that we should be thinking about the questions that we're asking. And as I say, I think we should be the example. And if we're not happy, then I think our students will also not be happy. Obviously, if we were together in a room, you'd be free to disagree with me and we could talk about it more. And obviously, I'm simplifying things. I'm sure there are lots more things that we could say. But as a general point of principle, I personally think this is quite important. Right, another activity for you, and another activity which is very easy to do, that all you need is the blackboard, paper and pen, okay? 2-minute tic-tac-toe. Tic-tac-toe, of course, is British people, we call it noughts and crosses. You draw 9 squares on your blackboard, okay? And you write different topics in the different squares, yeah? We've got sport, cinema, music, etc. And the rules are extremely simple, okay? We tell our students that they're working in pairs. Student A chooses a square, and they need to talk about the topic for 2 minutes. Obviously, at a lower level, maybe you decide that you want just 1 minute. Maybe you decide you want 30 seconds. Maybe you want 5 minutes. You decide, okay? But the idea could be a minute, 2 minutes. If the students are capable of talking without too many hesitations for 2 minutes about the topic, then the square is theirs, okay? And they can put a nought or a cross. And the idea, of course, is to get 3 squares in a line. It's a very simple game. It's a competition. It has a very clear aim, a very clear objective, okay? You will notice that I have put learning English in the middle, and I did that on purpose because usually people want the middle square because it helps them to often win the game. And if they talk about learning English, then it's really interesting for us too, because we can learn more about what they think about learning English. So you can decide whatever topic you want them to really talk about, put it in the middle. That's my tip. Because usually in the middle, everybody wants to take that square. Somebody, Nicolina, has just said exactly what I'm going to say. We can adapt this to different topics. And what I sometimes do is I simply put this on the board. And I tell my students to decide which topics they want to talk about. And that way, we're really involving the students in the whole activity from the beginning. So they could put video games, they could put the Grammys, they could put the Oscars, they could put whatever topic they like. Now, when you think this activity is just completely minimalistic, all you're doing is putting 9 squares on a board, but you've probably got a 15-minute speaking activity, okay? The students do this working in pairs. You walk around the class, you help, you monitor, you correct, or you give guidance. Okay, so extremely simple. Do try it out and let me know how you get on, if it works for you. Okay, right, I'm going to show you a few more activities. This is for the generation of students who always take selfies, okay, and always take photos with their smartphones. Extremely simple again, okay? Everybody can draw a rectangle, I think. The screen of a smartphone is pretty simple. We've got a rectangle. And the activity is as follows, okay? We've got these different steps. I'll read them aloud. This was a tip that appeared on Gateway Facebook page. You ask the students to draw 3 rectangles, imagining the rectangle is the square, is the front of their mobile phone, and you tell them that to draw selfies or photographs that they took, for example, in the holidays, at the weekend, last week. They draw 3 pictures. Then they have to show their pictures to a partner, and their partner has to ask them questions to find out exactly what they did. Now, if you look at the 6th stage, I think it's really good because their pictures are often very bad. And when the pictures are bad, it makes it a funny activity, but it also makes it more speculative because it's not very clear what the pictures show. So you get lots of funny speaking, you get lots of laughter because the students are sharing their drawn selfies, okay? And it's just another great idea for talking, for example, about the weekend. Okay, so very simple activity. At the end of this session, I'll give you the address of Macmillan Gateway Facebook page, and there are lots more activities like this that you can see. Okay. Now, I think we've got 2 more activities before I finish. This one, again, is a very structured activity where we simply ask the students to think of as many question words as possible. Now, can you do that in the chat box? Can you just write down any question words? So we've got where, when. Can you think of any others? Why, how, what for is a good question. How long is a good question. How often, how many. Right. Now, it's important when we begin this activity that we don't tell them what is going to happen next. They write down, they brainstorm all of these question words, and when they've finished after a few minutes, then you simply ask the students to write down one question for each question word that they thought of. And the idea is that each question is about their partner. So how many? So we could simply ask the question, how many times have you been to London? How many times do you play football a week? The good thing is that they have a structure because they know that the rules would have to be following each question word. They would always have to think of a question for that question word. So it's very structured. If they have 6, 7 question words, they write down 6, 7 questions. Okay. And I think the alternative, for example, we could say, okay, ask your partner about the holidays, but without the structure, I don't think they would do it. I think the structure of forcing them to do stage 1 is what makes this work. Of course, then the students interview each other. And following my principles from earlier in the talk, then do some feedback where at the end of the activity you get them to give you feedback, something interesting they discovered about their partner. And then following another principle from earlier in my talk, get the students to ask you some of their questions. Okay, and so we've got, again, quite a long activity, but we've got a very clear structure for it. Okay. This doesn't have to be in pairs. It could be in small groups too, obviously, or you could do the first one as a whole class activity. So it's pretty versatile too. You can adapt it. Okay. And again, simply my tip is making sure that we give specific goals. And I'd like to contrast 2 activities. Okay. First activity, talk to your partner about what you usually do after school. If I said this to my students, most of them would shrug their shoulders and say, I play football, and the activity would finish after approximately 20 seconds. Okay, so I would suggest that a way of varying our instructions is something like this. Find at least 5 things that you and your partner both usually do after school. Okay. Now, I think this is the same activity really, but it works much better because first of all, we have a specific goal. Okay, so it says find 5 things. It's also open-ended, and this is very important for multiple choice. Sorry, for mixed ability. Sorry, for mixed ability, because often some students finish very quickly and they get bored. But if you say at least 5 things, then it means that they don't have time to finish. Okay, so it's more appropriate for students of different abilities. And finally, just a small point, but it promotes empathy and a positive atmosphere because you are getting the students to think about things that they have in common. Okay, so they're not thinking about differences, they're thinking about similarities. Okay, so you know, this activity is very simple, but it's just a way of thinking about the instructions. The way that we phrase an activity can be important as the activity itself. Okay, because this, I think, is very different from the previous question. Right, and my last activity, which is fast photos, which I often do when I give talks around the world. It's one of my favorite activities. This is very simple too. I am going to show you a photograph for just 3 seconds. The photograph will then disappear, and I want you to type in the chat box anything that you remember about the photo. Okay, so can you do that? Give me details about the photo. You're only going to see the picture for 3 seconds. Are you ready? Here we go. 1, 2, 3. Okay, so what did you see? A computer, right. CDs. Where were the CDs? Actually, there was a watch. And did you see what color the watch was? An analog watch. That's good detail. I like that detail. Actually, this is exactly what I look like now, because right next to me I have my analog watch with me, and also my water. Right, okay. Now, this activity works well because you want to show me how clever you are, because you want to show me that you saw these things and you remember. Okay, so there is a very clear, simple task. It's funny, it's competitive, it's interesting, and the students forget that they are talking about, they forget that they're talking in English. They just know that they're doing an activity that they enjoy doing. Okay, I'm going to show you the picture again so that you can check whether your ideas were right. That is in fact exactly what I'm looking at right now in my room. So this is exactly what I have. I think Yamel from Puebla, you mentioned the USB sticks. You saw my colorful USB stick. Right, now this is where I spend my life, in fact, in front of this computer. Very simple activity. Now, if I show you this photograph and I ask you, for example, how many people can you see in the photograph? Okay, how many people can you see? 8 people, right? What am I wearing? Right, now, I think that these questions are not very good questions, because you can see the photograph, I can see the photograph, and there is no reason for you to speak to me in English or to say anything, because we can see the same thing. So I think the idea of the activity is a challenge. You need to challenge the students. When the photograph comes and the photograph disappears, there is a reason to speak. In this case here, there is not much reason to speak, I think. So, very simple activity again. Any photograph on the computer or a photograph from a magazine will work. Right, here are my last 2 tricks, and then I'm going to finish. The first one is a silly tip, but it works for me, and I call this sorry. Now, if you don't speak Spanish, this is a quick Spanish lesson for you, okay? So the student says, oye, Dave, ¿cómo se dice paraguas en inglés? Okay? And what I say in that case is, sorry? Okay? And then the student says, ¿que cómo se dice paraguas en inglés? And then I say, sorry? And I just keep on saying sorry until the students realize that I want them to say it to me in English. Exactly, then they turn to English. So finally, the students realize that, okay, how do you say paraguas in English? Which is, of course, umbrella. Yeah? Now, this is something that I just do all the time in my class. And so when I say sorry, it's a very gentle indication to my students that, hey, say it to me in English, okay? It's just a silly little trick, but it works very well. So when they say something in Spanish, it's not maybe because they want to say it in Spanish, it's because they forget what language they are speaking in. And I think this often happens with our students. They speak spontaneously in their first language, which is obvious and which is natural. But what I do then is I simply gently suggest that they should repeat it in English. My last suggestion is the X factor, and this is the less gentle approach, okay? Now, I'm sure you've got one of these. Do you have this evaluation book, an assessment book, a mark book? I'm sure that you've got an evaluation book. Now, I think that evaluation, we often think that evaluation is about grammar, it's about writing, and not about speaking. And I think it's very important to encourage students to speak because it's part of continuous assessment. So I tell them that obviously people who are trying to speak to me in English, I will give them an extra mark, and people who don't speak in English, then of course they will not get that extra mark. So it's a way of encouraging students always to try to use as much English as possible. Okay, now I'm going to answer the question about instructions in L1 in a second. I just want to remind you that if you're not already part of the Gateway community, then join the Macmillan Gateway Facebook page, because there are lots of other activities, videos, tips there, and we can stay in touch. If you do have questions that I don't answer now, then please join me there. Somebody's mentioning instructions in L1. I think this depends very much on the level of the students. And in general, I think it's fine to use a certain amount of L1. I think we need to encourage students not to be lazy and to try to speak as much as possible in English. But as I said before, a certain amount of your L1 language depends on, on being a human being and allowing them to say things to you. And if there's something that's very frustrating to explain in English and you can explain it in 2 seconds in your own language, then I think that that's fine. So to answer your question, I think a little bit of L1 is fine. Okay. I think somebody mentioned that the sorry trick would only work if you're a native speaker, but I'm not sure if that's true. Okay, I think you could try that technique because you might just remind them. It's a gentle reminder that they need to have a go in English. It's been a real pleasure. I can see lots of comments, and I would love to spend the rest of the day talking to you about all of these things. But of course, time is carrying on. I'm going to pass you over, in fact, to Mike Riley back in Macmillan, London. Mike, are you there? Do you want to take over? I will be still here for a few minutes. Thank you very much, and I hope we're in touch in the near future.